So I'm going to wind up this lecture series in epidemiology with a couple of talks on ethics in epidemiology. The first talk is going to be about some key principles, and the second talk is going to be more about particular issues that arise from time to time. So how do we define ethics? This is from the Dictionary of Epidemiology, and it defines it as the branch of philosophy that deals with distinctions between right and wrong, with the moral consequences of human actions. Ethical principles govern the conduct of epidemiology, as they do all human activities. So that is a fairly broad definition, but when we think about ethics in epidemiology, we may particularly be thinking about the effects, the ethical implications for participants in our study. That's usually the first thing that comes to people's minds, but the ethical responsibilities of epidemiologists are much broader than that. They extend really to all of society. We have a responsibility to collect data ethically, because many of the results that we obtain actually have broad societal implications. But we also have ethical responsibilities to those who fund our research. They rely on us to carry out the research in an appropriate way, and to our employers, and also to our professional colleagues. So all of those groups will be extremely embarrassed if we do not carry out our studies in a completely ethical way. So these concerns were not always present in the United States among researchers, and then we need to refer back to the Tuskegee experiment, which really, when it came to light, it changed everything as far as the ethical conduct of studies in the United States and also generally around the world was concerned. So the Tuskegee experiment, which some of you may already be familiar with, it took place in Alabama between 1932 and 72, 40 years, and it was run by the United States Public Health Service. So it began in the early 30s when 400 African American men with syphilis were recruited. These were poor men, sharecroppers, and they were basically told that they had bad blood, and really that it would be good for them to participate in the study. They would get free medical treatment and meals, and if they were to die, then they would get their funeral expenses paid. And the actual purpose of the study was to follow them over time to see the natural course of syphilis. But they were not told that they had syphilis. They were just told they had bad blood. And of course, as a result of the lack of knowledge of what they had, a lot of their wives and children were infected. And when treatment became available, because in the 1930s there were no effective treatments, there were no antibiotics that were available. Antibiotics became available in the 1940s, but even when they became available, I think penicillin was the first to arrive, and it became the standard of care in 1947. Nonetheless, the participants in this study were not offered the chance to be treated. I think the general sort of reasoning at the time was, well, this has gone on for so long, really, that the syphilis is unlikely to be useful for them. So they weren't told about the availability of the treatment. And this continued for 40 years, and many publications came out of the study, and they were published in medical journals. And the first that anybody really paid any attention to the study in terms of whether it was appropriate was in 1972, when a journalist, Jean Heller, investigated it, and she published a story in the Times drawing attention to it, and this caused a lot of embarrassment. The Secretary of Health Health, Education and Welfare shut down the study, and there was an inquiry as to what had actually happened, how this could have gone on for 40 years, and nobody paid attention to it, even though doctors were reading the medical journals and they were well aware that the study was going on. It apparently not occurred to anybody that maybe there was something inappropriate in carrying out the study. So here we have a couple of pictures of participants in the study. poor sharecroppers. This is a white doctor who's treating them, or not treating them, as the case may be. And here is a research nurse, African American, who assisted the men through the study. So these revelations really shook things up, and it led to the passing of the National Research Act in 1974. And a major requirement of this act was the institution of these institutional review boards, usually referred to as IRBs, or in some countries they're called ethics committees. And finally, in 1997, President Clinton apologized for the US government carrying out this study. And that was not the only unfortunate experiment that the US Public Health Service carried out. And there was another one. It was only revealed in 2011, very recently. But this was a study that took place in Guatemala in 1946 to 1948. And was the US Public Health Service interested in finding out whether or not penicillin could be preventive as far as STDs was concerned. It paid syphilis-infected Guatemalan prostitutes to have sex with prisoners. And about 1,300 Guatemalans were infected with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid, all STDs, of course. And this was shut down, I think, possibly because the doctors' trials, the Nazi doctors' trials at Nuremberg occurred around about this time, and some of the Nazi doctors were actually sentenced to death. And in some ways they had carried out similar experiments on prisoners in concentration camps. So there was never any publications from the Guatemala experiments, possibly because there was some embarrassment at the time. And this was only revealed, the study took place was only revealed in 2011, and this led to President Obama apologizing to the President of Guatemala after there was the revelation of these experiments had taken place. The National Research Act led to the setting up of the Belmont Committee, which issued its report in 1979, and this reviewed basically research ethics and laid down these basic principles that should be applied in any study involving human subjects to be carried out from now on in the United States. And there were 4 principles, although sometimes the second and third are collapsed into one. They're just categorized under beneficence, but I've expanded them into these 4. Respect for persons, sometimes referred to as autonomy, then beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. So let's go through them one by one. So the first one, respect for persons, also sometimes referred to as autonomy. So autonomy means freedom to make decisions for oneself. The basic implication of this principle was the need to obtain informed consent from participants in any epidemiology study. So, and by informed consent I mean provision of accurate and complete information using appropriate language so that it is informed, and it needs to be voluntary, and the person who is being recruited needs to understand that they are free to withdraw from a study at any time, even if they say that yes, they're willing to participate. Then they can change their mind at any time, and there will be no penalty, no threat of withholding medical treatment or anything like that. And so, and also that there must be no coercion, and by coercion I mean you cannot pay them a large amount of money so that they are tempted to do something that they otherwise might not want to do. And similarly, nowadays you could not use prisoners because you might, for example, imply or tell prisoners that you would be willing to give them some remission of their sentence in return for them participating in the study. So that's considered to be coercion. Might get them to do something they wouldn't otherwise agree to do. And if the participant in the study, or the potential participant in the study, is a minor, less than 18 years of age, then you may need to get additional permission. Some responsible person, such as a parent or guardian, may also need to give permission, although the minor themselves also should give their consent to participation. And the whole process needs to be documented. So there's an informed consent form that will need to be signed and also witnessed. And so it can usually be witnessed by the person administering the consent. But if the person who's going to be the participant is unable to read or write, then you usually need to have an additional witness who can sign in their place. Anyway, there are many rules governing the informed consent, and the final form that is used, has to be approved by the IRB, and they'll usually stamp it, and so that it's very clear what they have approved and what they haven't. So this just lists a number of the things that the consent form should include, and which should be conveyed to the potential participant. So the purpose of the study, and also who's funding it. That's very important. And you need to tell them fairly fully what participation will involve, the various tests and things that will be carried out, or if there's a questionnaire, what the content of the questionnaire will be, and if there are any risks or discomforts, then they need to be told up front, and then they can be told the benefits of participation. Receiving some money in return for participation is not usually regarded as a benefit by the IRBs. That's the money that is given to them is basically given to them in return to compensate for them for their time and trouble, but it is not considered to be. It is not appropriate to put it forward as a benefit of participation. They need to be told what will happen to the information that's provided, and how it will be kept confidential, and also that applies to what will happen with any specimens such as blood or saliva or urine that's collected. Any of those, they need to be fully informed about what will happen to any of those things. They need to know that they can withdraw without penalty at any time, and there should be some assessment of the participants' understanding of the information. So that can be quite hard to do, but it is required by the informed consent process. Because then we need to be confident that the potential participant is actually informed. Now there are circumstances when we can get informed consent waivers, and one of those situations is in, say, retrospective cohort studies, where, if you remember, we do not ever actually contact people. We're basically linking various databases to try and determine the health events that have occurred to people over the course of the follow-up period, which may be several decades, and it would not be practicable to actually seek informed consent from these people. Many of them will have died, and many of them will have moved away and be impossible to track. So if we were to carry out a retrospective cohort study, which actually required us to track down these people and get informed consent, then we'd end up with a very biased study, largely of people who would tend to be people who had remained healthy and who had remained in the area and more readily contactable. So we don't generally get informed consent for retrospective cohort studies. It's a little different from most epidemiology studies where we use individual data in that respect. For most other studies, such as prospective cohort studies, case control studies and cross-sectional studies, we will actually get informed consent. There's no good reason not to, but not retrospective cohort studies. Another circumstance when it may be appropriate to get an informed consent waiver from the local IRB is when we carry out a secondary data analysis. So a secondary data analysis usually involves data that's been stripped of any individual identifiers, and it's a secondary analysis in the sense that it was not really what the study was originally carried out for. So very often in epidemiology we think of other purposes for which we can analyse data, and we carry out those analyses. But we don't need to know generally who the people are, and it's possible to get a database which is totally stripped of all identifiers. And in those circumstances it may be quite reasonable to have informed consent waived. Something like program evaluation is a typical situation also where you would get informed consent waivers, or an informed consent waiver. And then two other circumstances, routine disease surveillance and outbreak investigation, other circumstances when informed consent waivers may be entirely appropriate. And this raises an issue to do with the potential conflict between individual rights and societal rights. And this comes up quite often in public health. And so we have two perspectives basically. The individual perspective, which says that everybody should have the right to choose what sort of risks they take and what should be done with any information about them. And then there's a societal perspective, which says that some protections are so important to society as a whole that they may override the individual right to give informed consent. And so the outbreak and routine disease surveillance are two such instances where generally it's regarded that the societal perspective takes precedence, because it's important to prevent outbreaks from spreading, and as part of that, of course, we need to have effectively operating surveillance systems which cannot depend on informed consent for data to be passed up the line. You remember we talked about surveillance systems in a previous talk, where data is collected locally and then sort of passed up through the local and state levels to maybe the CDC, where it's analysed and to get the larger perspective. So in those circumstances, things have to move right along. We cannot rely on getting, we cannot be dependent on getting informed consent. That would simply slow things down, and the overall, the final public health impact may be much worse. So it seems fairly clear in that sort of situation that the societal perspective reasonably overrules the individual perspective. Other circumstances, chlorination of water supplies. Most people seem to think that chlorination is acceptable, even though not everybody is given their permission to have water supplies chlorinated. On the other hand, fluoridation, there's a lot of debate of the individual perspective versus the societal perspective. And one or the other prevails in different communities. People will often argue that that they do not want their water supply fluoridated when it confers no benefit on them, and they might argue that it only confers benefit on children whose teeth are developing. However, in more recent times it's been shown that fluoridation actually benefits everybody to some degree. So everybody receives some benefit from that, and to a degree, at least it's my perception, that the debate over fluoridation has largely faded away, although it raises its head from time to time. Another area where there's a lot of debate between the individual and the societal perspective is immunisation, childhood immunisation. There are plenty of parents out there who refuse to have their children immunised. On the other hand, the societal perspective would say it's important to have as many people immunised as possible, so as to produce herd immunity, so that the links between unimmunised people are broken, and and we have this phenomenon of herd immunity, which prevents infectious diseases from spreading more widely. So we often administer a questionnaire, and we get data on people, self-reported data, but we may also collect biological samples, and this collection of biological samples can raise a whole new set of issues. So we have to get the permission of the participant in terms of what can be done with the samples, and we need, if we're going to keep the samples past the end of the study, past the time when we've carried out whatever testing we're going to do, we need to get the prior agreement of the participants. So, and there's a lot of sensitivity to this now, particularly as potentially biological samples, particularly say blood or saliva, can actually be, potentially people can be identified just because everybody has a unique genotype. So there's some sensitivity towards keeping, continuing to keep biological samples, because there's at least a theoretical possibility that even if the personal identifiers have been removed entirely, there's still the possibility that by doing genotyping, it may be possible to link the sample back to a particular person. So if it's decided that it would be a good idea to carry out further tests that were not really thought about at the time that the samples were collected, and of course this happens all the time because scientists are constantly inventing new ways of looking at biological specimens. So it's inevitable really that you collect some samples, and that by the time you come to actually analyze them, then there will be other methods that are available to test them. So it does pay to get a fairly open-ended consent from the participant when you do get consent. So, but then you have to, if you do have other ways that you want to test the sample, you have to get IRB approval for those new tests, and often the IRBs will not give that approval unless you've got prior agreement to this possibility. So for that reason, you need to get that broader consent from the participants. Now, it's also, you have to give some assurance of maintaining privacy and confidentiality. So these terms are often used synonymously, but they're not actually synonymous. So privacy is basically, in the context of epidemiology studies, it has a lot to do with preventing other people from accessing the knowledge that a particular person has participated in a study. So that means that when you set up a study clinic and you have people come along and you carry out some interviewing and some testing, you need to go to a little bit of trouble to shield one person from another. So you don't want everybody, you may have multiple participants coming at the same time, so you need to use sort of barriers and curtains and so on to make sure that the knowledge of the participant's identity is not actually more widely revealed, even to other participants. Confidentiality, on the other hand, is all about maintaining an anonymity of the information collected, and making sure that there's no way, in terms of the data collected, that any individual person can be identified. And so, of course, when we publish our results, we only publish summary statistics, and if there is something that is specific to a particular person that we need to actually publish in our results, we need to really make sure that that person or persons are not identified in any way. So that's privacy and confidentiality, commonly mixed up with each other, but that's the distinction. So the second principle that I want to mention is non-maleficence. And basically all this means is that one should not needlessly cause harm or take unnecessary risks with study participants. And sometimes it's summed up in this paraphrasing of the Hippocratic Oath, which is first, do no harm. And if you don't take proper care to prevent harm to study participants, then this might be considered to be negligence and may be legally liable. The third principle, which is relates in many ways to the previous one, is beneficence. And this is all about maximizing benefits and minimizing risks to our study participants. So this could be, particularly in intervention studies, there could be a balance. And we talked about the principle of equipoise in one of my previous talks. Whereas in observational studies, we are basically observing people, we're not intervening, so it is easier to ensure that the benefits outweigh the risks in observational studies. But in experimental studies, it is possible that the risks could outweigh the benefits, and that's something we have to carefully consider. One of the risks, of course, in carrying out observational studies is that the information that we could violate those principles of privacy and confidentiality, and the information about a participant could become more widely known. So we have to take various precautions to prevent that from happening, such as keeping the data in password-protected databases, or if we have paper-based questionnaires, then it needs to be in a locked filing cabinet usually, and usually that should be in a locked room, and only a very restricted number of people, possibly only the principal investigator, should actually have the keys to be able to get access to those data sources. So, and also important when the participant is, say, a child or somebody who has some sort of impairment and not in a position to give informed consent, we need to involve somebody who is responsible for that person, somebody who's a caregiver, a relative, or a guardian or parent. The fourth principle, enunciated by the Belmont Committee, is the principle of justice. And this is the need to take into account to whom the risks occur in carrying out any study, and to whom the benefits of the research accrue. And in other words, that it should not be, as it was in the Tuskegee experiment, that the risks were entirely taken by the study participants and the benefits accrued entirely to others. So for this reason, it's important that research also benefits socially disadvantaged groups. And in that respect, if you carry out a study and you submit an application to an IRB, and you do not have in it any minority group, any minority participants, or any women participants, or any participants who are minors, you actually have to justify that. You actually have to explain in the IRB application why you are not including any of those groups in your study. Here at Berkeley we have our own IRB, which serves the entire campus, not just the School of Public Health. And the Berkeley IRB, usually referred to, or often referred to, as the Committee for the Protection of Human Subjects, is run by the Office for the Protection of Human Subjects. And the Berkeley IRB basically consists of two committees, and they divide their responsibilities according to the nature of the application that's sent to them. One of them has more of a biomedical focus, and the other one has more of a social science focus. And the IRB application here is submitted online, and I give you the website there, and we submit all our applications online, and any amendments to the applications. And this really does definitely speeds the process up. I can say that as having lived through the old days when we had to submit paper-based applications, the online submission process is much speedier. Now the thing is that we need to get IRB approval from all of the institutions that are participating in the research. This includes not just in the US, but if we're carrying out our research in another country, we have to get local IRB or ethics committee approval, as it's sometimes called, from the overseas IRB. And this can cause problems sometimes. I have known circumstances when it's been necessary actually to set up an IRB in another country because they didn't have one. And there are guidelines or rules, in fact, laid down as to the composition of those foreign IRBs. So that can take a bit more time if you have to set one up, although they're becoming more widespread now, IRBs or ethics committees. But all of them have to basically approve the research. So this can cause some problems, although in terms of the Berkeley campus, we often work with colleagues at Davis and UCSF and other UC campuses. And now there are quite a few interinstitutional agreements whereby once the IRB at the lead institute, the institute that's really sort of taking the main responsibility for the grant. Once that is obtained, then the other IRBs will largely rubber stamp that. It used to be much more complicated having to negotiate between IRBs to get their joint approval and make sure that they were all agreed on the same way that the study should be conducted. This brings me to what are often complaints about IRBs or ethics committees, and I want to say here that this is not directed at the Berkeley IRB because I actually think they're very good. They're very efficient and very responsive. So I'm very happy with them. But it's not always the case in many instances. And certainly, if you're carrying out research overseas, then it's often the case that foreign IRBs can be very slow. There are often a lot of complicated rules that are not immediately revealed. So if you are carrying out international research, then try and get in early. There's likely to be a long lead time in terms of getting IRB approval in another country. And the IRB here will not allow you to proceed until you've got the IRB approval in the other country. So anyway, people often complain that IRBs are under-resourced and overloaded, and there's a slow turnaround time. That's certainly the case in many instances, although, as I said, I think the Berkeley IRB is actually very smooth and efficient and very responsive. Easy to talk to. If you have a problem, just give them a call, and you can usually get things sorted out very quickly. IRBs, they're often, concern is that they often lack the expertise to understand the research that you're proposing. And in some instances that can certainly be the case. They are bureaucratic, and there is this inconsistent response that you can get if you have to deal with multiple IRBs for the same research project. This, as I said, has largely been overcome, at least within the UC system, and also with Stanford. There's quite a good relationship between the UC system and Stanford, such that if we get an approval here, then Stanford will approve it very quickly, generally speaking. So I guess it's a matter of the IRBs having confidence in each other, and hopefully these interinstitutional agreements will continue to become more common. But never underestimate the time that it might take to go through this process, because they want a great deal of information, and there's a lot of crossing of T's and dotting of I's to be done very often, particularly when it comes to the final wording of the informed consent form, which has to be approved very specifically by the IRB, and you may need to get it translated into other languages, and that can complicate the process also. So finally, just want to say that you may get your IRB approval. Hopefully you will. Usually we do. Sometimes it just can take time and negotiation and going back and forth. But just the fact that you've got it does not in itself absolve investigators of responsibility. You can't just say, oh, I've got IRB approval, therefore what I'm doing must be ethical. Inevitably, when you get into the field, circumstances change, and you may have to make some decisions. And you may have to go back to the IRB and say, well, it wasn't exactly as we anticipated, so we're going to need to make a change. Hopefully the IRB is sufficiently flexible that they can approve an amendment fairly quickly, but that's not always the case. But in any case, just because you've got IRB approval does not mean you're absolved of responsibility. That investigators have to constantly be looking over their study just to make sure that everything is being carried out properly and appropriately.